Correspondences between sound and gameplay modality in minigames, sonic framing functions. Presented by Stephanie Lind at Queen's University. Funding for this project is partially provided by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Super Mario Party and Nintendo Switch Sports are popular social games, partly because of their focus on shorter, quick-to-learn activities that players term mini-games. These internally nested structures also often occur within more narrative-centric games such as the Legend of Zelda series. Music and sound act as important demarcations to cue the players to these minigames within their overworlds. This is the second half of our project examining gameplay modality and representations of time. In the first half, which I presented at NACVIGM this year, I examined how the magic circle can be used to understand how flashbacks are framed through music and sound. While that study focused on the shift from cutscene to player-controlled gameplay within narrative games, this paper will examine similar framing in the shift from overworlds to minigame participation by the player. For the sake of this paper, I will define minigames as short games contained within larger game worlds. That is, the minigame features a change or shift in narrative and ludic parameters and is other to the main gameplay. In minigames, the player elects to undertake a small, restricted activity such as fishing, horse racing, playing a sports match, or collecting tokens. This independent bubble of play is framed via specific sonic gestures. In this paper, I will therefore examine what components serve to separate the minigame from regular game space, how this shift in frame is sonically established, and how these sounds correspond to changes in gameplay modality. My methodology will rely principally on soundscape analysis to show sonic contrasts and their coordination with other gameplay parameters. This is a continuation of my previous work, including my 2020 paper on Assassin's Creed and several of the analyses presented in Authenticity in the Music of Video Games. But this is also inspired by James Ellis's recent work on gestural analysis, such as that presented at last year's LUDO conference, and Tim Summers' graphical representations of musical architecture in understanding video game music. In answering my three questions, I will also discuss issues of frame, scholarship on the frame by Irving Goffman, and extensions of that to the study of film music by Adriana Guerra will help to flesh out these connections. Let us begin with a visual representation of basic game structures. Tim Summers, in Understanding Video Game Music, contextualizes the analysis in the first chapter of his book through a diagram that summarizes the typical musical architecture of a video game. This is shown in Figure 1. This diagram depicts basic game components such as menus and cutscenes, in addition to musical structures such as introduction cues, loops, and other stingers. Summers explains that this abstracted model represents a standardized practice, and it is useful for identifying the most common musical elements of games, since it shows the types of cue normally included in games. While all minigames vary in particular respects, we can nevertheless identify a similar recurring architecture to them. For instance, minigames are often framed from the game overworld via a mirrored entry and exit formula. As depicted on Figure 2, the minigame is often introduced by silence that breaks from the previous overworld music, shown in number 1, and this typically initiates an instruction phase such as a tutorial or course overview. Next, shown with number 2, a sonic cue initiates the active minigame engagement. In the following phase, shown with number 3, an increase in intensity occurs in both gameplay and musical parameters. The minigame competition concludes with another sonic cue, shown again with the number 2. Finally, a brief moment of silence occurs to transition the player back to regular gameplay, shown with number 1. The gray zones on the figure represent the presence of music, versus the white zones of no music. And these closely correspond to the level of interaction the player has with the game, which I've approximated with a blue line on the diagram. The numbering on the diagram clearly shows the mirrored structure, with the transitions into and out of the game bounded by numbers 1 and 2 in each direction. As Julianne Grasso outlines, musical transitions can act as framing devices to distinguish different gameplay modalities. Grasso argues that ludic temporalities are established by these musical events. She states, "Music exists through time, and time in games is organized by narrative events facilitated by play. Music is also meant to accompany the actions of the player in that space. Navigating a cave, defending against enemy attacks, and so on are interactions with their own ludic temporality, structured by the predetermined storyline of the game. And musical changes, with whatever narratives we might assign them, commingle with these other ludic temporalities in games." In the model shown on the figure, transitions are achieved not only by music, but at times by other sonic elements. The lack of music, as well as the inclusion of 2 sonic framing cues. This flips Grasso's model, but nevertheless still serves to delineate different game events, commingling ludic temporalities with sonic temporalities. The prior and subsequent gameplay, for instance, typically involve a more relaxed exploration through the overworld, whereas the active gameplay bounded by the sonic transitions involve in-the-moment engagement by the player with stricter gameplay parameters. Let's examine this type of minigame framing in a concrete example, the horse races from The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom, released in 2024. Figure 3 shows sound events within the minigame sequence in green text, different musical tracks via vertical colored bars, and the approximate level of player control via a blue line. First, the instructional phase begins. See number 1. Here, the player avatar engages in dialogue with the minigame's NPC via button prompts. There is thus a reduction in the amount of player control compared to the game overworld. Once the dialogue is complete, the music drops out and the camera pans to an overview of the course, leaving only diegetic sounds. Next, at number 2, a sonic cue consisting of 3 bings and a whistle initiates the race, at which point the player assumes control of their character and faster tempo music begins. The race itself, represented at number 3 on the figure, increases the gameplay rhythm, with the player taking active in-the-moment control. The end of the race, shown with a number 2, reverses the cueing process. A whistle, followed by an ascending arpeggio on scale degrees 3, 5, and 8, acts as a cadence to signal the race's conclusion. At this moment, the player no longer has direct control, but instead passively observes the race completion sequence. To mark the end of the minigame, the music drops out and we once again hear diegetic-only sound. Finally, represented at number 1, the sequence concludes with a return to discussion between the avatar and NPC before returning to regular game space. Note that I've cut the game overworld music ending here just for the sake of time for this presentation. A lack of music, represented by the white zones on the figure, is thus used to frame out the race. However, the different use of musical tracks also serves to frame separate gameplay modalities. The overworld theme, shown in green, is heard before the beginning of the minigame and after ending it. The ranch theme, shown in light blue, is heard when the player avatar speaks with the instructional NPC before and after the race. The core of the race plays the horse race theme from Ocarina of Time, shown in gray. The tempos of these 3 songs mirror the player's level of control, both narratively and ludically. The overworld theme features a tempo of 140 beats per minute, while the player is in direct control of their character. The instructional phase's ranch theme, where the player engages with dialogue prompts but is otherwise unable to move, features a slower tempo of 92 beats per minute, while the race, which the player must complete as fast as possible, features the most rapid tempo of all 3, a brisk 152 beats per minute. Further changes in game rhythm and musical rhythm serve to frame up the minigame from regular game space. Diegetic versus non-diegetic sound frames the active race gameplay. The ranch theme frames up the dialogue from non-dialogue. And the change from one musical track to another frames out different gameplay modalities, from free roam to dialogue to race and back again. In addition, the horse race internally frames out its player engagement via typical song structure. It features both a musical intro and outro to frame its repeated A-B form, musical structures that cue the player to the race's beginning and end. Given this focus on frame, let's take a minute to explore this term. In my earlier paper, I explicitly linked the player's conceptualization of game space to the magic circle, pulling from Katie Salen-Teckenbosch's and Eric Zimmerman's description of this as a specially demarcated time and space. Such separation of narrative, and in this case ludic spaces, is supported by previous work by Adriana Gorajuela in film music, who observes that narrative asides, such as flashbacks, establish separate narrative spaces, and that shifts between these are often marked by auditory or visual cues. She notes that such cues may take the role of narrative anchors, evoking and reactivating spaces. Furthermore, Irving Goffman, in Frame Analysis, observes that cues can indicate the gameplay frame in traditional games, theater, and radio drama, but also that such cues act to frame our perception of an event, separating it from reality or giving it new context. Music can serve as a bridge, a signal that the scene is changing. Such music does not fit into a scene, but fits between scenes, adding an entirely different level of application than music within a context. For the purposes of this paper, I will term the establishment of such game spaces through sound the sonic frame, which I define as a boundary established by changes in sound that demarcates changes in gameplay. Let's examine this frame within a second minigame example. Super Mario Party's Whomp's Domino Ruins game board, playing in Mario Party multiplayer mode. Like the Zelda example, similar sonic cues at numbers 1 and 2, and changes in musical tracks, represented by color bars on the figure, frame out the active gameplay from more passive components. In this clip, we hear the game overworld music, depicted in green on the figure, first interrupted by an ascending jingle to cue entry into the minigame space. Next, the music track changes to a jaunty oboe timbre and oompa bass, represented in blue, to accompany the game selection screen. A new chime signals another shift, this time to the instruction phase of the minigame, accompanied by a third musical track, now represented in pink. When the active gameplay initiates, a musical intro and a verbal "start" cue introduce the game, accompanied by a fast-paced musical track represented in gray. The race ends with a verbal "finish" and a brass ascending cadential gesture, here represented in yellow. Next, a descending harp cue reintroduces the oboe oompa track, now at a slower tempo, to showcase the results. An ascending chime concludes the sequence by bringing the player back to the overworld and its music. The mirrored structure is once again present in this example. For instance, the transitions at number 1 on the figure employ an ascending gesture for the moment of entry and a descending gesture for the moment of exit. At number 2 on the figure, the spoken words "start" and "finish" indicate the boundaries of the active player control. There's a clear demarcation of what exists inside the minigame versus what exists outside. The music's tempo also coordinates with other components of gameplay. The overworld music has a moderate tempo of 112 beats per minute. The instruction phase and wind-down phase, areas of passive player interactivity, both feature a slower tempo of just over 100 beats per minute. And the mini-game play in the middle features a faster tempo ranging from 132 to 200 beats per minute. The game selection screen seems to be an outlier at a faster 146 beats per minute. But this tempo is in sync with the visuals of the scene, a rapid alternation between possible game selections. This sonic parameter thus acts as a signal to the player about the changes in interactivity, separating the game's various spaces, selection, tutorial, and gameplay, from one another. Such framing can also occur on a micro level within sections. Take, for instance, the music heard during the Nintendo Switch Sports, depicted in Figure 5. Its overall framing structure closely resembles that of Super Mario Party. A two-part instruction phase gives a player tutorial and course and contestant overview. The active competition gameplay is framed by verbal start and finish indicators, and a wind-down phase gives the competition results. Chimes cue the shift from one zone to another, and levels of player engagement roughly correspond to overall song tempos. However, at the micro level within the active gameplay, in other words the gray zone on the figure, some important frames occur. In the survival bowling minigame, for instance, the instrumentation of the music varies depending on player action. During their turn, the instrumentation features an acoustic big band timbre with saxophones, brass, piano, bass, and toms, accompanied by diegetic effects such as the sounds of other contestants in the bowling hall. Whereas while the player is merely spectating, the same song shifts to brasser timbres, emphasizing electric and digital tone production. Hammond organ and MIDI versions of brass, woodwinds, piano, and bass, for instance, in addition to a more snare-heavy drum set. Diegetic sound effects are muted here. A similar change from more acoustic forward timbres to digital electric forward timbres also occurs in the regular versus replay modes of the other sports within the game. The effect is one of diegetic versus non-diegetic framing. Differences in volume, reverb, and other sound effects further differentiate the two play states of participant versus observer from one another. These sorts of sonic differentiations may seem obvious, and composers are certainly aware of them. Winifred Phillips, for instance, in A Composer's Guide to Game Music, identifies both music as a pace setter and music as demarcation as two possible functions in games. In musical demarcation, she describes that the focus is on strongly delineating in-game locations and bluntly outlining the differences between different gameplay types. The music has become a figurative fence, separating things from each other. However, what is not discussed is the layering of these different frames. Goffman might provide some insight here. He states, it becomes convenient to think of each transformation as adding a layer or lamination to the activity. And one can address two features of the activity. One is the innermost layering, wherein dramatic activity can be at play to engross the participant. The other is the outermost lamination, the rim of the frame, as it were, which tells us just what sorts of status in the real world the activity has, whatever the complexity of the inner laminations. While the video game analog to Goffman's innermost layer would most likely be the narrative of the game, I'm more interested by his outermost lamination. In my minigame examples, this rim is sonically demarcated through direct cues such as verbal start and finish indicators and chimes or jingles, but also indirectly through musical contrasts including tempo, melody, and musical form. Furthermore, the rim of the frame is not just demarcated sonically, but also in terms of interactivity. Is the player actively participating or passively watching? Are they pressing single-button responses, or are they fully controlling the character in multidimensional space? The answers to these questions might provide some insight into how players engage and identify with avatars and how they experience game immersion.